Hello, conservation voters. This is Lindsay Cross, Government Relations Director with Florida Conservation Voters, and I'm so thrilled to be sharing part of our public lands pillar with you by inviting some phenomenal folks in conservation to be part of our public lands partner panel this evening. And we're going to have fun talking about just a whole host of things related to public lands and management and wildlife. So I want to introduce some of my friends and colleagues that are graciously offering their time to share some of their expertise and their real life experiences out in the field with us tonight. So our first guest is Nell Armstrong with the Southern Fire Exchange. Nell, I'm going to give you just a minute to introduce yourself and tell our friends a little bit about what you do.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. My name is Nell. Like Lindsay said, I work with the Southern Fire Exchange. I am the outreach specialist. And if you haven't heard of Southern Fire Exchange, we work with fire science communication, specifically in the southeastern region of the US. And I'm also working on getting my master's at the University of Florida, and I'm studying in the School of Forest Resources and Conservation, and I'm studying the effect that season of burn has on the reproduction of 6 understory species in a longleaf pine sandhill.
Wow, that sounds really awesome, and I want to hear a little bit more about your day-to-day experiences and your research in a few minutes. We also have Shane Welindorf with Tall Timbers Research Station and Conservation. Shane, introduce us to yourself and a little bit about what you do with Tall Timbers.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm Shane Wellendorf, and I'm the Conservation Coordinator with Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy. Tall Timbers is probably best known for its research station, which does a lot of work with prescribed fire and wildlife research. But Tall Timbers is also a regional land trust, and that's the part that I work in. And we do land conservation projects throughout North Florida and South Georgia, and primarily do conservation easements. We hold 145,000 acres in conservation easement with 121 landowners. So my role there is to work with new landowners to do conservation easement projects, and then I also oversee all of our conservation easement stewardship with our existing landowners.
145,000 acres. That's quite a lot. I can barely manage a quarter-acre lot here in St. Pete. And Jen Korn, who is a wildlife biologist with Johnson Engineering. Welcome this evening. Thanks so much for being here, Jen.
Hi there. Yep, I'm originally from Texas, and that's where I did my PhD, working with ocelots. And I bring that up because it was primarily on private lands, which is what led me to Florida, where I originally worked with Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission as a Florida Panther biologist, where I worked mostly with private landowners. And now I'm with a private company, Johnson Engineering, where we still do such a wide range of work, where sometimes it's permitting, sometimes it's wildlife surveys, still a strong focus with panthers, working with agencies to do remote camera surveys, work with wildlife crossings, but I also get to do lots of other things. Like today I did Caracara surveys. So it gets to range now into all sorts of other protected species and working with both public and private lands.
So just from our brief introductions, I know that each of you have significant experience out in the field. And one of the things that's so phenomenal about Florida is just the amazing ecosystems that we have and how different they are throughout the state. Our pine forest, our Everglades, our swamps and our wetlands, our coastal areas. And I know each of you probably specialize in some certain areas and certainly are represented in different regions throughout our state. Nell, you being in the central part of the state, in Gainesville, Shane up in the, the Red Hills area outside of Tallahassee, and Jen representing the South Florida area. But I would love if you could spend a minute or two and tell us about some of the, the field experiences that you have and how that ties into the importance of land protection, whether that is on public lands like our parks and preserves, or whether it's involvement in privately owned that are being managed for either wildlife or other conservation values. So Mary Nell, in your capacity, I know that you're doing a lot of work on the land management side and specifically with fire. Can you talk about maybe one of your first experiences or something that really stuck out for you as being, just kind of a seminal experience in prescribed fire management?
Well, I guess I began my prescribed fire experience in St. Petersburg, in Boyd Hill Nature Preserve, and it's very starkly different than other places I've gotten to burn because if you know St. Petersburg, it is very, very densely developed. So that part gets to burn maybe once every 2 years because there's so much urbanization around it. They have a lot of smoke management concerns to work with. And there's a lot of older people in the community, which is, of course, another smoke concern. There's a higher risk community. As compared to when I've worked with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, my crew burned all over the Southeast, and we burned a lot of areas that were more rural. So in a rural area, or even on tall timbers where you have a huge amount of land that you can burn, you don't have to worry so much about smoke management. You can get a lot more burned at once. Not be too concerned about all those other issues. So we get to burn a lot more. We have what we worked with is called the Interagency Burn Team.
Mm-hmm.
So we have private organizations like the Orient Society and the Nature Conservancy that are working with state organizations like the Department of Natural Resources. And also we sometimes work with the feds, with the Forest Service. And this interagency burn team gets to help get fire everywhere that we need it, because there's so much fire needed, and it's a resource limited thing because there's only a number of days you can burn. People will say like every day is a burn day, and that's true, but every day is a burn day for a very specific area. So when we have a team like that with all sorts of different ecosystems that we're trying to manage, we've got a lot of land ready to go, ready to burn, then you really have a lot of resources that you can pull together and strive towards the similar goal that we have.
Great. So Mary, now for those people that aren't familiar with prescribed fire and burning and the role of it in the ecosystem, can you maybe step back and talk about how it plays into just good land management and why it's particularly important here in the state of Florida?
Sure. So throughout the Southeast, including Florida, these ecosystems that we have here, especially pine savannas or anything with like a pine dominated canopy, they are fire dependent, which means that they need fire in order to sustain that ecosystem. So our pine savannas typically have a pine overstory, minimal to no midstory, so not a lot of shrubs, and then a very diverse understory, which in the coastal plain, it's actually a biodiversity hotspot because of this incredibly diverse understory because of the frequent fire. So when we have, and it's adapted to frequent low intensity fires, surface fires, unlike what you see out west, these aren't canopy fires. So when the ecosystems don't get this kind of fire, when there's fire suppression, then woody species start to come up, oaks start to come up, they shade out that understory, and those plants can't compete. They aren't shade tolerant. So the understory will be eliminated. You'll get a midstory, which a lot of the wildlife that is native to these areas can't survive in. And it also inhibits pine regeneration. So the ecosystem will entirely change, and it'll change quickly, which is a problem that happened when there was an era of fire suppression. So now we have a lot of what we call duff. There's duff accumulation, where it's this not entirely decomposed organic matter that's on the ground near trees. So it takes kind of a low intensity fire under wet conditions to slowly take away those layers of fuel. And by fuel, I mean anything that'll burn. So pine straw, a shrub, anything like that.
So So Duff is not just a beer on The Simpsons, I guess. It's something we're concerned about and keeping our fire management practices. Shane, I know that with Tall Timbers, land management is an important component of what you all do. What are some of your favorite experiences being out in the field and, working with landowners, being part of land management teams? Can you share some of those?
Sure, be glad to. My first half of my career at Tall Timbers, I worked as a research biologist. I'm a wildlife biologist by training, and being at Tall Timbers, it gave me a great opportunity to work with landowners all throughout the Red Hills. And these are some phenomenal properties that have been using prescribed fire for a long time. They're passionate about conservation. They're passionate about wildlife. And it was a great place to learn what it takes to manage a forest in a sustainable way and to manage for wildlife in a broad spectrum of uses. And so, we got to interact with landowners that are thinking about their forests, not only for tomorrow or not only for production, but long-term, thinking about forest sustainability, thinking about managing, forests in an uneven sort of way. And then, folding in that interest and passion for wildlife, whether it was quail or Bachman sparrows or gopher tortoises, there was a strong passion across these properties. And, where it really goes to show how it takes this mix of passionate landowners and good management in order to maintain these ecosystems. It takes a little bit of it all to pull that off. And, having that exposure early on in my career to passionate landowners and good land management was key to my beginning in Florida.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Shane. Talking about wildlife, I know, Jen, you probably have a job that is enviable for any people who are self-proclaimed cat people, because you're dealing with one of the most amazing cat species that we have in North America, the Florida Panther. I'm sure that you have lots of stories, whether it's working with the Florida Panther or the Kara or other phenomenal wildlife species in the state. What are some fun stories that you can share with us?
Well, I think people sometimes get confused that when you're really specialized, that means you just snuggle that animal all day long. And that's not the case, unfortunately. I have gotten to snuggle a few panthers, but it was very specific situations. It's actually very rare to just see one. Most of the time I'm seeing on a camera or, when I worked with the state, actually be on a capture or something. But I'll tell you, this is a perfect example that you asked to tell you about this day I had. It was December 30th, so 2 days before the end of the year, obviously really tough year. I was doing Kara surveys on some public lands or state lands a couple hours south. So I was already having a good day. It was Kara surveys. Mm-hmm. But I was finding panther tracks in the trail and happened to actually look up and see a panther walking down the trail in front of me. And got a few really horrible pictures, but so already fantastic day, Kara and a panther sighting, because that's actually the first time I've seen one where I wasn't in a vantage, I wasn't tracking one with a collar or something like that. It was just random. And then that same day, I drove a few hours north to go do a different project and happened to see an indigo snake that day come out, just look right at me, got some awesome pictures. I'm thinking this trifecta day. I've seen Karas, I've seen a panther, I've seen an indigo snake, and it was in a variety of public and private lands throughout where I'd been that day. So it was just kind of this. It made me also feel that maybe the next year would be better. Into this year, so it was such a good day. Next year is not going to be great. So yeah, I'm really lucky that it's not every day is like that, but to spend so much time in the field, there are moments like that, of course. And also just the variety of lands that I get to be on. It's not always just public land or private lands, a mixture.
Yeah. And so I want to talk about the idea of size and the concept of bigger is better, maybe, and connectivity when it comes to lands. And, we've talked about, the idea of public lands and private lands. Jen, I'm going to go back to you. With species like the Florida Panther that we know that they require, a fair amount of habitat. Can you talk about what some of those habitat needs are for the Florida Panther? Like, how much land do they really need, and how do we in the conservation community, help to maintain that or really add to the existing habitat that they have right now?
So they are obviously a very wide-ranging animal, but really they're kind of habitat generalists as long as there's enough upland. They'll use some of the wetland habitats, if depending on how deep the water is, if there's prey there. But obviously, like mostly, they'll prefer to keep their feet dry if they can. But a male's home range is somewhere around 200 square miles, which is the size of 4 Magic Kingdoms. That's the size of 96,000 football fields. So it's very big. And females obviously have a smaller home range, about 85 square miles. Down, south of the Clusatch River, it's a little easier to kind of get those big open spaces. We have those really big public lands, really large private ranches. And even a little bit north of the Clusatch, when you start talking about this kind of south central area, like the Ridge and around there, we still have quite a few large private ranches. But once you start moving north from there, obviously it becomes more fragmented, and it really becomes very important. Not that it's not still important down south, but really to have these connections and wildlife corridors and wildlife crossings, so that way, even if the patches get smaller, there are connections between them for them to navigate the landscape. And maybe it's a bunch of small patches that add up together to be, a larger area that they can use. And, it can be public lands, private lands, and, it doesn't have to just be that the government wants to buy everybody's property, because that's not the case at all. It can be private lands that are in conservation easement. So it's just not going to be developed, but it stays a private ranch. When ranches are great wildlife habitat, and private landowners and ranchers are great wildlife stewards. So being able to work with them and with individuals like Shane and Mary, like that can provide them with the proper, land management, prescribed burning, so that they can manage their lands. And panthers are an umbrella species. So basically that just means that if you have land that is healthy for a panther, that means that every other species underneath that, in terms of like a trophic, food web, is going to do well too. So deer, quail, gopher tortoises, red cockaded woodpeckers, everything. So that's another really important aspect of that. So yeah, I honestly believe that Florida still has that capability for panthers to survive and to even still keep recolonizing some of their previous land in Florida.
Well, I know that the efforts of groups, especially like the Florida Wildlife Corridor and the Path of the Panther movement, are really showing that there still are opportunities if we have the resources and the motivation to actually conserve those lands and make sure that we have the right management in place for those species. I do have hope that we can still do it. I know many others do too. You mentioned a couple species like quail and gopher tortoises. Jen, both you and Shane. Shane, up in the Red Hills region and where Tall Timbers is operating, what are some of the wildlife species that you are managing for, and what might some of those techniques look like?
Yeah, in the Red Hills, quail has always been kind of the species of interest, and it's a popular game bird, popular bird for hunting. But it's a native species, and a lot of the management requirements and the habitat requirements that are associated with quail are associated with lots of other species tied to those pine savannas, whether it's a gopher tortoise or Bachman sparrows or red cockaded woodpeckers, which are species of high interest and were federally listed for many years. And even with these small species, big contiguous blocks of habitat is absolutely critical. If you look at places where these species are still, have stable populations still thriving, where you still have the ability to hunt wild quail, They are in large contiguous blocks, whether that's in the Red Hills where you've got lots of landowners that are managing in a similar way, or even down south in some of the ranch lands like where Jen's from, around Kenansville and some of those other areas, Three Lakes and Kissimmee Prairie, those areas, where you've got large, big contiguous blocks that are still being managed in a similar way. It's what it takes. A quail's lifespan and its population cycle is very different than a big charismatic cat. But, as these very local populations, expand or, become productive, and then you have other areas that are lost, you need to have that large kind of panmictic population that can help fill in those gaps and keep that overall population going and sustainable. And, the truth is, whether you're talking about a little tiny sparrow or a quail or even some of our bigger charismatic species, you've got to have these scales. And just to give you some perspective, our biologists feel that it takes, in North Florida anyway, it takes a minimum of about 35,000 acres. And we have a goal of 35 to 50,000 acres of contiguous blocks of habitat in order to maintain the system like we want it. In order to maintain quail, in order to maintain, other species of interest, including some of these more threatened and endangered species, you need blocks of that size in order to do that. So, we need to be thinking at a larger scale for all critters.
Mm-hmm. That's a pretty significant size area, Shane. Mary Nell, when you talked about your start in prescribed fire at Boyd Hill in St. Petersburg, which I know that park because it's just a couple miles from me. Pinellas County is one of the most densely populated counties in the state. You compare that to some of the more rural, less densely populated areas in other parts of the state. From a land management perspective, particularly in terms of prescribed fire, how does having bigger pieces of property aid in the work that you do, and what are some of the challenges if you're trying to burn a piece of property, on a smaller thing in an urban setting? I know you mentioned a few things at the beginning, but let's just kind of circle back to that idea of, how you maybe change up your burn plan depending on the size and the location of that property.
Well, one of the benefits to having a large area of land that you can manage is being able to create a mosaic, like pyrodiversity. So a lot of species, especially like wild turkey, is one that we're focusing on and with Southern Fire Exchange right now and working on a fact sheet. They like to have a recently burned unit, one that was burned within the past 6 months, next to one that was burned within the past year, next to one that was burned within the past 3 years or so. And the reason for that is because then you have all these resources right next to each other. So you cover right next to forage. And that's incredibly important because when you have like little poults, little turkeys growing up, like the more they travel, the less likely they are to survive. So having that mosaic right next to each other is really important. And when you have a small area and that Boyd Hill, you might only get to burn once every 2 years, it'd be really challenging for those turkeys to find those resources. And as for burning next to urbanization or high-risk areas, the way that you can mitigate those challenges is you'll have, so a prescribed burn is called a prescribed burn for a reason. We literally write a prescription ahead of time. The burn boss writes a prescription, and there are certain parameters, and that includes weather parameters. So it'll say you can burn with a wind speed of, 3 to 10 miles per hour or something like that. So when you're burning next to a high-risk area, the 3 biggest factors that burn boss is going to need to be careful with is wind speed. You want a wind that is fast enough to be pushing the smoke out of the area, but not too fast, not too high, that there's a risk for a spot fire into an area that you didn't want to burn that day. The wind direction matters, of course. You don't want to be blowing smoke into that nursing home. You want to be blowing it away. And then the third factor is mixing height. So if you've ever noticed like smoke going up into the air and then it just kind of stops at a certain place, or you might see it with fog and it looks like it just hit a ceiling. Like we literally called that the ceiling. So if you have a high ceiling, a high mixing height, then that smoke can get up and away. But if you have a low mixing height, then that smoke is going to stay in the area. And that can also cause problems if you're burning later in the day, especially at night when that mixing height is going to be low. And that smoke can actually flow down into rivers or streams, and it'll sit there. And if you have a road or a highway going through that area, then the cars are going to experience smoke. And we do put up smoke signs, not like smoke signals, but signs that say, you know, prescribed fire, smoke ahead, or fog ahead, or something like that, that prepare people. But they can only do so much. And for some reason, some people want to drive faster when they see fog, like, oh, I'll get out of it quicker. So that's something that the burn boss also wants to pay attention to. And they'll know the structures that are around the area. They'll know what roads are nearby and what they need to be looking out for.
You know, Lindsay,
Yeah.
From our perspective up in the Red Hills, you know, land fragmentation, it makes a challenge for the ability for us to implement prescribed fire. I mean, I give all the credit in the world to our prescribed fire burners and managers, and the state of Florida has one of the best prescribed fire systems in the nation. But the fact of the matter is that as more land fragmentation happens, as more, you know, low density development kind of creeps into these rural landscapes, it gets harder and harder for, you know, fire practitioners to burn the way they want to, or the way that these ecosystems need to be burned. You know, and we're burning things at a fairly high frequency and, you know, a relatively high density intensity. And so when you've got to worry about where your smoke goes and worry about your wind directions, it begins to limit how effective you can be with fire. And it does have an impact. And the larger tracts are easier to burn, frankly, and the less risk that land manager takes on when he does burn. So, you know, minimizing fragmentation is really important for us to be able to implement fire in Florida.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. You know, it does come back to the idea of the connectivity and the corridors. And Mary Nell, I think it's interesting that you use the term mosaic when it comes to the burning and how that's happening within a site. I know that ecosystem restoration practitioners talk about habitat mosaics. If you're restoring a site or you're protecting something, the importance of having a mixture of habitats, especially as we see transitions in habitats due to sea level rise or climate change, or just natural transitions, for example, salt marshes transitioning into mangroves. But it's the first time I've ever heard it in terms of management, and I think it really makes sense that you want to have, you know, you're going to maximize the land that you have, and we can help to do that by the frequency and the type of burning and other management techniques that happen. So yeah, I love that you shared that. Jen, the work that you're doing to better understand the species that are using these lands and these waters, do you ever have the opportunity through your research and your projects to you know, share that with land managers or, you know, state agencies, and, you know, make recommendations like, if you change this management technique, this is going to be better habitat for Florida panthers, or support these other species? How would something like that happen?
So I actually had a really cool project with FDOT a while back where we did a bunch of research looking at, it was about wildlife crossings, but also, so obviously if you look at existing wildlife crossings, most of them are down south, and there's a bunch of them on the alley, right? Well, there's a few up here. But there's also a couple of really cool ones. There's one on State Road 80 in LaBelle that actually was a retrofit. It was already just a canal under the road that they went in and just added shelves and some fence and just started getting panthers using it, I mean, almost right away. So there's all these options to have wildlife crossings that don't necessarily have to be a brand new 4 million or more wildlife crossing built from scratch. Although there are obviously places where that will have to happen because there aren't ways to retrofit, but there are these other things to do. And when you think about kind of South Central Florida, so places between like I-4 and Caloosahatchee, think about all the different rivers and streams, and there's actually some topography more than like down south. Mm-hmm. So when you go over a bridge, if you go down and look underneath it, some of them already kind of just look like a wildlife crossing under there, and it's just a bridge that had to be built because they need a bridge there. So I monitored a bunch of those as well, basically trying to tease out what were some of the dimensions that certain species prefer, things like panthers and bears, but also white-tailed deer, because that's a prey animal for panthers, and because they're very picky about what kind of height or length and things they like to walk through. So that's one example of where I actually did some work and then shared those results that hopefully can help kind of tease out how some of the wildlife crossing constructions and things can go on in the future. But other things that and I used to do a lot of outreach when I worked at FWC that I still continue now, just because I've made so many connections that people still come back and go, hey, can you still talk about panthers, whatever? I'm like, yeah, great, I know, yeah, it's fantastic. So do lots of outreach stuff as well. But land managers that are looking for any kind of information can always contact FWC biologists. That's free help right there. Any of these organizations like Tall Timbers and Fire Exchange, they can contact NRCS, they can contact their extension office. I mean, anybody is, there's always all these resources that we hope that they know are there. And then if they ever get involved in anything they think might be involved with permitting or regulatory, to definitely contact a professional to help them walk them through that kind of stuff, companies like my company. So there's lots of resources available.
That's great. I'm there using that. I know that with new road projects, they're looking at putting in more wildlife crossings, but it's good to know that there's opportunities to retrofit some of the places. I know there's, maps of some of the most dangerous roads, not only for people, but for wildlife. And, you're able to find kind of these hot spots where if we made investments in safe and appropriate wildlife crossings, we might reduce fatalities both for wildlife and for people. So Shane, I heard you mention something about water, and certainly in the South Florida area, restoring and maintaining the Everglades ecosystem. What are some ways that we're using land management to manage for our water resources as well? Because it's not just about the upland areas, it's also about our wetlands and our rivers and spring systems. Are there things that Tall Timbers is engaged with? And Mary Nell, in a minute, like, just prescribe burning play a role in protecting our water resources? So Shane, I'll start with you.
Yeah, in North Florida, we're also blessed with some amazing rivers, whether it's the Osceola River, the Ocklawahamie, or the Apalachicola. These are phenomenal waterways, and just tremendous forests that go with these waterways. And the first action is to keep these forests and these wetlands intact. And that is one of the primary goals that Tall Timbers has for land conservation in and along these waterways and in these floodplains is to keep these forested areas intact, because as Jen's pointed out, these waterways are oftentimes the linkages to to other conservation lands beyond in the uplands that are associated along with these things. So protecting these forested wetlands is key. We also deal with a lot of isolated wetlands and gum ponds and other things that actually have fire as part of theirs, especially ephemeral wetlands. And a lot of times these are embedded inside of your flatwoods or inside of your sand hills. And these are areas of tremendous wildlife diversity and just amazing diversity. But they must have fire. They've got to be burned. These ephemeral wetlands, like you have in the Apalachicola National Forest, if you stop burning them, they change completely. The vegetation structure changes, and its use for a lot of the rare species, such as flatwood salamanders, goes away, in a relatively short period of time. And so even when you're thinking about wetlands and water, fire does play a role there. And so, one of the things that we're always trying to do is not only restore wetlands and restore their hydrology, but also restore management, whether that's to remove trees that weren't supposed to be there or add fire after, years of fire exclusion. And so, fire does really play a role in protecting those wetlands.
Yeah. So Mary Nell, you're back. You disappeared in a cloud of smoke, and now you're back, right?
Yeah, I don't know what happened.
Yeah. So the joy of technology. But maybe you heard that question about Shane was talking a little bit about how important it is for burning, for protecting water resources. Is there anything that you wanted to add to that, or some projects that were maybe specifically geared towards the role of prescribed burning as part of managing, these larger ecosystems with water resources?
Well, water resources is not something that is in the forefront of our minds when we burn, but prescribed fire does enhance water quality in the region by reducing the ecosystem water use. And it also, very importantly, reduces the risk of wildfire by taking away preventing of fuel. And when there's a hot, high intensity, high severity wildfire that covers a region, the soil can become hydrophobic. So what that means is, like, if you've ever had a potted plant that you forgot to water for a really long time and you pour water on top and then it just kind of sits there, that's hydrophobic. And the same kind of thing happens after some high intensity wildfires. So then when a rain event comes along, it'll wash all that brand new like ash and soot and everything that just burned and is sitting there on top of that hydrophobic soil. It'll wash that into the nearest waterway, a river or a stream. And two of the biggest problems that causes is a nutrient influx. So that is a lot of nutrients that could have been put into the forest, but are now washed away into a water system. And then also sedimentation. You have a lot of like larger particles now in that waterway. So prescribed fire can kind of help keep that from happening.
That's fantastic. It's such an important tool. When the state acquires land, management is certainly part of it. I know, Shane, you all have lands that you manage, and also working with the private landowners are doing some of that work. Can you talk a little bit about some of the different tools that we use to protect land? I know you use the term conservation easement. We've talked about public lands, and some that the Tall Timbers is specifically involved with.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Our primary tool that we're working with private landowners is a conservation easement. And simply put, it's an agreement between a landowner and an easement holder that will limit certain rights on that property to protect those conservation values associated with that property. In many ways, it is a transfer of a portion of rights that goes from the land to the land trust, and that land trust is responsible to make sure that those conservation values are being maintained. It's a perpetual agreement. It runs with the land. It lasts forever, but it allows for a landowner to own the property, to manage the property. Oftentimes, it allows for lots of different types of rural compatible uses, such as agriculture, forestry, hunting, fishing, but it will limit the ability for that landowner to do industrial uses on that property. It's going to limit their ability to subdivide that property or break it up, fragment the property into smaller and smaller pieces. And it's going to limit the amount of future new construction on that property. So its intention is to keep it in that rural land use. Oftentimes, many just like it's being maintained and managed now. And, the state of Florida has had a phenomenal land buying program. I mean, we are blessed with lots of great public lands. I mean, almost a third or a little more than a third of the state of Florida is permanently protected. But you look at it on the flip side, that's almost 70% of the state that's in private holdings. And, much of our water, much of our wildlife reside and are part of our private lands. And so using tools like conservation easements are absolutely critical, I think, to maintain, what we're interested in. Easements are not for everybody. It takes a special landowner that is willing to open up their property to a land trust or to a government entity like a state agency to hold that conservation easement. But for many landowners, their land is their passion. They've got their blood, sweat, and tears in it. It's a multi-generational property. And an easement is one way to ensure that all of their hard work and investment is going to pay off. You think about a landowner that's been protecting or, very carefully managing a longleaf stand. That's a species that can outlive us by a couple hundred years. It can be around for 300 to 500 years. Land ownership, isn't going to last that long, but the easement will. And so, we can work with these landowners to set up these conservation easements that are going to protect these special places that they've been interested in. And so it really is this tool in order to keep land intact, keep land in private ownership, and to maintain or reduce the amount of impacts from fragmentation and residential development. It is the number one tool that we have. And so, Toll Timbers does conservation easements, but there's lots of other great land trusts throughout the state of Florida that does conservation easements. There's over a dozen that are active in the state. There's some that have national mandates that are also working here in the state. And so, if land conservation and conservation easements are something you're interested in, there's lots of opportunities out there for you to work with a good land trust.
That's great, Shane. I know that Tall Timbers has certainly been a leader when it comes to your work with private landowners and conservation easements. And we are fortunate that we have a whole network of land trusts within the Land Trust Alliance. I think we're going to share a link to that for people if they are interested. And really, it is a tool that people can use to help protect their properties. It's also something that not only land trusts, but our public agencies can look at when they're deciding the best way to protect a piece of property. There's also options for the state to purchase land to create parks and preserves that have more public access and maybe have a mixture of uses, whether it's recreation or being protected for biodiversity or wildlife habitat. But really, that comes down to the funding that we have for those programs. I know that Tall Timbers and most land trusts have the capacity to raise some money on their own, but also programs like Florida Forever that's administered by the Department of Environmental Protection, the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program through Department of Ag. You can do conservation easements with both of those programs with the Florida Forever priority list. There's also fee simple acquisition that occurs through there, and that's really the vehicle to save these last wild places and maintain these larger landscapes and this connectivity. With conservation voters, we're looking at making sure that there's enough money and that there's consistent funding for those great conservation programs like Florida Forever. We've seen that the governor's budget this year is suggesting $50 million in just for the Florida Forever program. And we know that number needs to go higher. We need to be funding, the whole suite of conservation programs so that we can protect not only those working landscapes and timberlands, but also that we have resources to protect lands that are close to where people live, through things like the Florida Communities Trust. So little pocket parks and preserves that also get people connected to nature and wildlife in their own backyards is important too. So we'll continue to advocate for full funding of those programs, getting back to the $300 million level where we were historically, and which was the vehicle to protect so many of the phenomenal places that we have in our state.
Yeah, if
Yeah.
it's all right, if I could provide just a little perspective on Florida Forever and conservation easements. You know, conservation easements are a great opportunity for the state going forward. It allows for lots of great indirect public benefit. You know, it's going to protect these habitats for wildlife. It's going to protect our water resources. But the state can buy those conservation interests in those properties at a much reduced price compared to having to buy out the entire property, right? And there is no long-term management obligations to the state of Florida. You gain all the conservation benefit without the long-term liability. It's really a phenomenal return on investment. And, you know, it's something that we've been advocating with the state of Florida to consider, because in many instances, keeping those lands in private ownership is going to be the best way to get the type of management done that needs to get done. But you get the assurance of the conservation easement that all of those cool things on that property, all the wetlands and all the things that we need to maintain this state, are going to be protected and preserved. And so, you know, conservation easements are a key. And you know, Florida Department of Environmental Protection has a great program, a great system for evaluating properties and projects, as does Florida Forest Service. I mean, both of these agencies have been doing this for a really long time. They've got a great system down. And, you know, I think that the state can be assured that when Florida goes through with a project, whether it's an acquisition or an easement, that it's been fully vetted out and it's going to get a good return on investment for Florida folks.
A really great example of conservation easements kind of making a huge impact is that crossing that I mentioned on State Road 80. That was a retrofitted crossing, and that also has a property just to the south of it that is under a conservation easement with the Nature Conservancy. The property just to the north of the crossing is under a conservation easement with NRCS, and the property just across the river is under a conservation easement with the Nature Conservancy. And all that was done on purpose, obviously. That was trying to create this corridor because we knew that was one of the areas where past collared panthers had crossed the river around there. So we knew, you know, they were kind of getting funneled up out of like OK Slough and other areas up kind of towards that area. And then now they've got a wildlife crossing and all of those protected lands that creates this corridor. So, I mean, just wanted to give a shout out to some more examples of conservation easements doing exactly what they're intended to do.
Yeah. And I think it's that when we think about conservation, that the people of the state kind of know that there's, you know, that we're protecting these lands for a reason. And there's people who are bringing all of their knowledge into these projects, and there's, you know, a plan, there's priorities for, you know, making the best use of our resources and, of course, protecting, you know, the beautiful places that we have left in our state. So I'm going to see if there's any questions from people who are watching on Facebook, and just take a moment to check in with that. And then I'll give you guys, you know, a last minute or so. If there's anything else that you wanted to share, we'll make sure that we put some links to your organizations or your, you know, favorite groups like the Path of the Panther or Southern Fire Exchange. Make sure people know how to learn more or sign up for your YouTube channel, or, you know, find ways to, you know, get connected with the land trust in their area. So a question from Christine is about, would eminent domain be able to override a conservation easement? So Shane, I'm going to direct that to you. Good question, Christine.
Yeah, that's a great question. Easements have a lot of strength, and they're extremely difficult to extinguish, but eminent domain through judicial proceedings is the one case where it can be. But if you want to make a case to limit or stop eminent domain, one of the few ways that you can do that is through a conservation easement. So unfortunately, no, eminent domain always reigns supreme, but it's the best case against it as far as you can get.
Great question, Christine. Any others that we have? Greg, are your prescribed fires only for wildlife and habitat, or do you also burn for protection of WUI areas? And Mary Nell, I assume that you know what WUI is, urban interface, wildlife urban interface areas.
Yeah, we call it the WUI, the wildlife interface areas. And what that refers to is what it sounds like wildlands directly adjacent to urban areas. And I'd say we burn for both. We catch a lot of birds in one net when we do a prescribed fire. We get habitat for wildlife. We get wildfire mitigation, water quality, restoring ecosystems for other ecosystem services. And it depends on the organization. I'd say whatever their goal is, whatever their mission statement is. Southern Fire Exchange, we don't do the burning. Our goal is to get the science to practitioners, to researchers, and to connect the two, and also policymakers to a lesser extent. But when I worked with the Department of Natural Resources, we were specifically burning first and foremost for rare species and to provide habitat for rare species. But at the same time, we're still mitigating wildfire risk in the process.
That's great. Thank you, Mary Nell. And Greg, thank you for your question. We learned a new acronym. That's a fun one. All right, let's see if there's any other questions. Any Panther ones? Of course. Peter asked, wildlife crossings are so important. There should be so many more. Species like indigo snakes and pine snakes, even salamanders, are declining rapidly due to roads, among other factors. And the issues of roads are often ignored in, I would say, in management. Just see the end of. So does anyone want to talk about the role of roads in either how they are a deterrent for wildlife? You know, what's wrong with roads? How about that? Jen, do you want to take this question?
Well, obviously they'll fragment habitat and also just provide an obstacle and danger. I mean, you know, they kill, you know, wildlife that tries to cross a lot of the time. And there's been a lot of ways that we're trying to find a way to kind of bring wildlife crossings into maybe mitigation. And it has happened in the past. So like sometimes if there's a project that's on a road, it might be put into that project's mitigation that they have to do a crossing. And so I've seen that multiple times to where that they have to put that crossing in to be able to fulfill whatever their mitigation roles are. So that's one way that we can kind of ensure more crossings happen. But also part of it's funding. I mean, there's a really great example out in California where they're trying to get the Liberty Canyon crossing in for, you know, these, basically it's in LA, and it's mostly privately funded. So that's an option as well. I mean, that is, you know, we usually think that that funding has to come from the state, you know, or federal or something like that. But if it may come down to one day getting a crossing in on I-4, although FDOT is fantastic and they're really trying to make that happen. But we may have to do something like that, this big, you know, privately funded where we reach out and get donations kind of thing to be able to get in some of these crossings. But I think one of the biggest things, like you said earlier, we have the hot spots identified. There was a bunch of groups that did research on that to identify them for panthers. And there are other groups doing research in other places that focus on smaller animals, like things like herps and so snakes and stuff. And they've put a bunch of smaller type crossings along a bunch of other roads that go through like the Ocala National Forest. So I think it's becoming more on people's radar to get wildlife crossings in as often as possible and adding it into other projects.
Great example. So for everyone watching, save your pennies. We'll do a little fun drive, pennies for the panther, to save the path of the panther. Hopefully it won't come down to that, but I know the people of Florida value our wildlife and our wild areas and our water. And I think that's evident in how many people vote for things like constitutional amendments to restore funding for Florida Forever and other programs. 3 constitutional amendments passed this year in 3 counties throughout our state to fund some of these local county programs. People love their natural areas and will continue to do so. So just if you guys have any last thoughts that you wanted to share, again, we'll make sure that folks watching know how to learn more about your organizations or efforts to save the panther. Mary Nell, anything you'd love to add?
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for having me on today, and thanks everyone for viewing and taking an interest in conservation. I've given about 4 links. I gave a lot of links for more information. The first one is going to be the Southern Fire Exchange website. And on there we have everything, all of our products, but then also announcements for other products, like any other webinars that are going on, fact sheets that have been produced, et cetera, about regional fire science. I manage a social media of Southern Fire Exchange. We have a Facebook and a Twitter, and I am constantly sending out science updates, alerts for events, things like that. We have a podcast called Friends of Fire.
Mm-hmm.
Find that on any regular podcast network, and it's also on our website. And I think the last link is to join our email list, where you will we only send out about 3 emails a month, so it's not overwhelming. If you're interested in fire science or just kind of staying up to date with what's going on, we have a newsletter that we send out once every 2 months that is just an epic synthesis of all things prescribed fire that happened in the last 2 months. And then I also put together just a few resources that talk about prescribed fire liability and policy. And I think that'll be going out too, if you're interested in that side of things.
That's great. I love how you described it an epic synthesis. That's what I'm going to start calling my things in staff meetings, an epic synthesis. All right, Shane, what would you like to share to close out our time together?
Well, thank you, Lindsay, and thanks to all the many conservation organizations and agencies out there working towards land conservation. It really does take a village, whether you're advocating with the legislature or, putting land conservation on the ground, like through land trusts or, through our agency partners, whether it's Florida DEP or USDA, NRCS, federal. It does take a lot of different groups to get land conservation on the ground. And so I'm appreciative to work with those and just so thankful that we've got great landowners out there that are just as passionate about land conservation as we are.
Well, thank you for continuing to make those conservation projects happen. We appreciate it. And finally, Jen, our Panther lady.
Dan, thank you so much for inviting me. Sorry that I was the only one who had pets that wouldn't behave. I don't know if y'all kept seeing I had to, and they're still down there looking at me being bad, but no, they're being good. I always tell people one of the most simple things they can do if they want to help panthers, because I get that question a lot. What do I do? You can buy a Panther license plate. I think it's $25. And that money goes to the Panther Fund that a lot of people don't realize 100%, basically 100% of what FWC does for panthers. So that means their panther biologists and everything that they do is funded by that, not from, federal funds or state funds, taxpayer funds. It comes from the license plate. It's a really simple way to help. And then if you're also just interested in learning about the panther, the Path of the Panther link is there. Something that Carlton Ward came up with, kind of an offshoot of all his work with the Florida Wildlife Corridor. I'm not a main player in that, but I get to sometimes kind of help out in some of it and kind of squeeze into some of the videos and things they do. But it's fantastic storytelling that tells people about panther conservation through his fantastic photographs and videos and all that in a way better way than I could ever explain. So definitely recommend people to check that out as well.
We will. Thank you. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much I appreciate all of you spending your time this evening sharing your experiences and some resources with everyone in the conservation movement. So thank you. We'll look forward to more great things, more land protected, more prescribed fire, and more time out in our beautiful natural areas. So thank you all, and hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Bye.